Then the illusion as swiftly faded, and, such being Louis' happy temperament, was forgotten. He disappeared into the parlour, took a piece of paper and an envelope from the small writing table behind Rachel's chair, and wrote a short note to Julian, a note from which facetiousness was not absent, inviting him to come at once. He rang the bell. Mrs. Tams entered, full of felicity because the great altercation was over and concord established. "Give this to that chap," said Louis, casually imperative, holding out the note but scarcely glancing at Mrs. Tams. "Yes, sir," said Mrs. Tams, with humble eagerness, content to be a very minor tool in the hidden designs of the exalted. "And then you can go to bed." "Oh, it's of no consequence, I'm sure, sir," Mrs. Tams answered. Louis heard her say importantly and condescendingly to the messenger, "Here ye are, young man." She shut the front door as though much relieved to get such a source of peril and infection out of the respectable house. Immediately afterwards strange things happened to Louis in the parlour. He had intended to return at once to his wife in order to continue the vague, staggered conversation about Julian's thunderbolt, but he discovered that he could not persuade himself to rejoin Rachel. A self-consciousness, growing every moment more acute and troublesome, prevented him from so doing. He was afraid that he could not discuss the vanished money without blushing, and it happened rarely that he lost control of his features, which indeed he could as a rule mould to the expression of a cherub whenever desirable. So he sat down in a chair, the first chair to hand, any chair, and began to reflect. Of course he was safe. The greatest saint on earth could not have been safer than he was from conviction of a crime. He might be suspected, but nothing could possibly be proved against him. Moreover, despite his self-consciousness, he felt innocent. He really did feel innocent, and even ill-used. The money had forced itself upon him in an inexcusable way. He was convinced that he had never meant to misappropriate it. Assuredly, he had received not a halfpenny of benefit. Nevertheless, he did not at all like the resuscitation of the affair. The affair had been buried. How characteristic of the inconvenient Julian to rush in from South Africa and dig it up! Everybody concerned had decided that the old lady, on the night of her attack, had not been responsible for her actions. She had annihilated the money, whether by fire, as Batchgrew had lately suggested, or otherwise, did not matter. Or, if she had not annihilated the money, she had done something with it, something unknown and unknowable. Such was the acceptable theory, in which Louis heartily concurred. The loss was his, at least half the loss was his, and others had no right to complain. But Julian was without discretion. Within 24 hours Julian might well set the whole district talking. Louis was dimly aware that the district already had talked, but he was not aware to what extent it had talked. Neither he nor anybody else was aware how the secret had escaped out of the house. Mrs. Tams would have died rather than breathe a word. Rachel, naturally, had said naught, nor had Louis. Old Batchgrew had decided that his highest interest also was to say naught, and he had informed none save Julian. Julian might have set the secret free in South Africa, but in a highly distorted form it had been current in certain strata of Five Towns society long before it could have returned from South Africa. The rough common-sense verdict of those select few who had winded the secret was simply that there had been some hanky-panky, and that beyond doubt Louis was at the bottom of it, but that it had little importance, as Mrs. Maldon was dead, poor thing. As for Julian, a rough customer, though honest as the day, he was reckoned to be capable of protecting his own interests. And then, amid all his apprehensions, a new hope sprouted in Louis's mind. Perhaps Julian was acquainted with some fact that might lead to the recovery of a part of the money. Had Louis not always held that the pile of notes which had penetrated into his pocket did not represent the whole of the £965? Conceivably it represented about half of that total, in which case a further sum of, say, £250 might be coming to Louis. Already he was treating this £250 as a windfall, and wondering in what most pleasant ways he could employ it. But with what kind of fact could Julian be acquainted? Had Julian been dishonest? Louis would have liked to think Julian dishonest, but he could not. Then what? He heard movements above, and the front gate creaked. As if a spring had been loosed, he jumped from the chair and ran upstairs, away from the arriving Julian and towards his wife. Rachel was just getting up. "Don't trouble," he said. "I'll see him. I'll deal with him. Much better for you to stay in bed." He perceived that he did not want Rachel to hear what Julian had to say until after he had heard it himself. Rachel hesitated. "Do you think so? What have you been doing? I thought you were coming up again at once." "I had one or two little things." A terrific knock resounded on the front door. "There he is!" Louis muttered, as it were aghast. End of chapter 10.